I never imagined a fight over my garden would end up in court. But when the HOA crossed the line and destroyed everything I had worked for, I grew a court case that had them running for cover. At first, it seemed like just another small inconvenience. You know, the kind of thing you dismiss as just part of life when you live in a neighborhood with an HOA. They send letters, make rules, enforce the occasional garden regulation here and there. Nothing major, right? But this time it was different. This time it wasn't just a violation of some trivial rule. No, this time the HOA decided to target something personal. They went after my garden, my pride, my sanctuary. The very thing that brought me peace in the middle of my busy life. They poisoned it, and they didn't even have the decency to do it openly. No, they poisoned it quietly, under the cover of darkness, using chemicals that could kill not just plants, but an entire ecosystem. I'm James Mitchell, a regular guy living in a quiet suburban neighborhood, doing what I love, gardening. And I never thought my little oasis in the backyard would make me a target for something so sinister. But when the HOA decided to destroy what I'd spent years building, I knew it was time to fight back. What I didn't know was that this fight would take me down a path I never expected. One that led to a courtroom, a public battle for justice, and ultimately, a victory that left the HOA running for cover. It all started one Tuesday afternoon in late April. I came home from work, exhausted, eager to unwind and spend some time in my garden. But when I opened the mailbox, I saw the familiar Pinecrest Gardens logo stamped in gold. My heart sank. The letter inside was short, but its impact was immediate. It was a formal warning. The HOA was demanding I remove my rainwater collection system from the backyard, citing unsightly structures and a violation of the community covenant. The letter was clear: either I took down the system or I would be fined. I stared at the letter, confused. My rainwater collection tanks, 3 large blue barrels behind a small wooden fence, had been in place for over 2 years. They weren't visible from the street. They weren't causing any harm. In fact, they were a sustainable way to water my garden. But now, apparently, the HOA had decided they were a problem. This wasn't just about water barrels. This wasn't just about a few tanks collecting rainwater. It was about control. It was about power. And suddenly, I realized that this wasn't just a harmless request. It was a full-on attack. I sat down on my front porch, the letter still in my hand. I could hear the birds chirping in the distance, the rustling of the trees in the wind. It was a peaceful day, until the HOA decided to ruin it. I had lived in Pinecrest Gardens for almost 5 years. The neighborhood was quiet, friendly, and peaceful, or at least, that's how it had been before Judith Winters became the HOA president. I don't know when exactly things started to shift, but I noticed a difference soon after she took over. People who used to chat in their front yards now avoided each other. Lawns became identical, with every flower and shrub planted exactly as the HOA approved. The fences were all painted the same dull beige, and any sign of individuality was quickly stamped out. Judith didn't just want to enforce rules. She wanted to create a perfect, cookie-cutter neighborhood. And when she found out about my rainwater collection system, she saw it as an act of rebellion, an affront to her vision of what Pinecrest Gardens should look like. She couldn't let that slide. It didn't matter that my rain barrels were tucked away out of sight, that they were legal under city code, or that they saved me money and water. To Judith, they were a symbol of something she couldn't control, something that didn't fit into her carefully curated idea of perfection. I crumpled the letter in my hand and immediately marched over to my neighbor Tom's house. Tom had always been a good friend, and I knew he had to have received one of these ridiculous notices too. When I knocked on his door, he opened it with a tired expression, holding up his own letter. "Got one too, huh?" he asked, his voice heavy with frustration. "Yeah," I said, shaking my head. "This is insane. They want me to remove my rainwater collection tanks." Tom sighed and stepped aside to let me in. We sat at his kitchen table, both of us holding our HOA letters, our faces grim. "Judith's on another power trip," Tom muttered, running a hand through his hair. "She's been targeting people with anything that's self-sufficient. I've been hearing rumors she's planning to go after people who grow their own food, too." I looked out the window, my mind racing. What's she going to do next? Tear down every garden in the neighborhood? She might as well, Tom said. She's already made it clear she doesn't want anything that isn't approved by the HOA. It's not just about rules anymore. It's about control. That hit me hard. The more I thought about it, the more it became clear that Judith wasn't just enforcing some rules to make the neighborhood look nice. She was making people bend to her will, stripping away the individuality that made Pinecrest Garden special. She wasn't going to stop at the rainwater system. She wasn't going to stop until she had total control. I can't let her do this, I said, my voice steady despite the anger bubbling inside me. I can't just give up my garden, my rainwater system. It's not just a garden. It's my life's work. These are rare plants, heirlooms passed down from my grandmother. Some of them don't even exist anywhere else. Tom nodded. I get it, but you need to be careful. Judith's been going after anyone who steps out of line. She's got the HOA on her side, and she's got connections in the community. She'll make your life hell if you stand up to her. I didn't care. Couldn't let them win. My garden wasn't just about plants. It was about my heritage, my values, and the future I was trying to build. I had spent years cultivating it, and I wasn't going to let Judith Winters destroy everything I had worked for. I'm not backing down, I said. This fight is just getting started. The next morning, I called the HOA office, hoping to resolve this issue peacefully. Maybe it was a misunderstanding, maybe they would see reason. I spoke with Marcus, the compliance officer, whose voice sounded practiced and cold on the other end of the line. This is James Mitchell at 1478 Sycamore Lane, I said, trying to remain calm. I received a notice about my rainwater system, but it's perfectly legal. The barrels are behind my fence and are completely out of sight from the road. I don't see how they could be considered unsightly. There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of keyboard clicks. Let me check your file, Marcus said, his tone distant. Yes, the board has determined that your water collection system violates Section 8.3 of the Covenant regarding unsightly structures. I froze. Unsightly? I repeated. They're not even visible from the street. They're behind my fence. It doesn't matter, Marcus replied, his voice cold. The determination has been made. Perhaps Pinecrest Gardens isn't the right place for your alternative lifestyle choices. Alternative lifestyle choices? Collecting rainwater? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was like he was implying that I was doing something radical. The more he spoke, the angrier I got. I'd like to appeal this decision, I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the growing frustration in my chest. You're welcome to address the board at next month's meeting, Marcus said, brushing me off. Until then, the removal deadline stands. I hung up, my hands shaking. The nerve of them. This wasn't just about rainwater. This was about control. They wanted to make an example of me because I had dared to do something outside of their rigid rules. They didn't care about the environment. They didn't care about my plants. They just wanted power. I immediately called the city planning office to confirm that my rainwater collection system was legal. The woman on the other end of the line was sympathetic. Yes, Mr. Mitchell, she said. Your rainwater system is absolutely permitted under city code. However, if your HOA has stricter rules in their covenant, they can enforce those rules. I knew that already, but hearing it from her made me feel a little better. I wasn't breaking the law. The HOA was. The next few days were a blur of anger, fear, and frustration. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think about anything other than the HOA's ultimatum. Every time I stepped outside, I saw my garden, my pride and joy, slowly dying before my eyes. The thought of losing everything I'd worked for, all because of a few barrels collecting rainwater, kept me up at night. But I wasn't going to let them win. I needed a plan. I needed to gather evidence to prove that I wasn't in the wrong. So, I did what anyone would do when they feel cornered. I started researching. I spent hours looking up HOA rules, legal cases involving similar situations, and even city codes related to rainwater collection. What I discovered was both comforting and alarming. Comforting because it turned out that my rainwater system was perfectly legal. The city had no problem with it. Alarming because I started to realize just how much power the HOA had and how far they were willing to go to protect that power. They weren't just trying to enforce rules, they were actively trying to control my life. That evening, as I watered my garden for what I feared might be the last time, I noticed something strange. A shadow flickered in the corner of my yard. My heart skipped a beat. I turned around quickly, but there was no one there. I chalked it up to nerves, to paranoia. But as I knelt to check my plants, I felt that familiar unease creeping back into my chest. Something wasn't right. Then, as I was walking back to the house, I noticed a car parked across the street, idling just out of sight. It was a black sedan with tinted windows, nothing out of the ordinary, but something told me it wasn't just a coincidence. I had no proof, but deep down, I knew the HOA was watching. They were taking notes, trying to intimidate me into compliance. I couldn't let that happen. The next day, I did what any responsible homeowner would do when they suspect their property is being targeted. I installed a security camera. I set it up to cover my entire backyard, particularly the area where my rainwater barrels were positioned. I felt a little paranoid, but after everything that had happened, I didn't trust the HOA anymore. 3 days went by without incident. I checked the footage every night just in case. But it wasn't until the fourth night, at around 2 a.m., that the camera captured something that made my blood run cold. A figure moved quietly along my backyard fence, dressed in dark clothes, and stopped right in front of my rainwater barrels. I could barely make out the figure's face, but the movement was unmistakable. The person was pouring something into my third barrel. I could barely breathe as I watched the footage, a sickening realization settling in my gut. Someone from the HOA had poisoned my water. I grabbed my phone and ran outside, praying I was wrong. But when I reached the backyard, my worst fears were confirmed. My rainwater tanks, which had been the pride of my garden, now looked wrong. The water in the third barrel had a strange sheen to it, almost as if it was reflecting the light in a way it shouldn't. I felt a wave of nausea hit me. I had to know what was in the water. I grabbed a container and took a sample, then rushed to my friend Rachel's lab at the local community college. She was a chemist, and I knew she could test the water for me. "Give me a few hours," she said, as I handed her the sample. Her face was serious as she examined the liquid. I paced back and forth, my mind racing with the possibilities. What kind of person poisons a neighbor's garden? What kind of power-hungry monster would go to these lengths to silence someone just because they didn't fit into their vision of the perfect neighborhood? When Rachel called me that afternoon, her voice was grim. "James," she said, "where did you get this water?" I felt my heart skip a beat. "What's wrong?" "The water's been poisoned," she said. "It contains high levels of copper sulfate and glyphosate. These are industrial-grade herbicides. If you use it on your plants, you'll kill them. Don't even touch it without gloves. This stuff can be toxic." The world around me seemed to slow down. My garden, my rare heirloom tomatoes, my grandmother's peppers. All of it was at risk. I'd been using that water to irrigate my plants for days. The damage had already started. The leaves on some of my tomatoes had begun to curl, the stems weakening. I ran back to my house, my mind racing. The slow drip irrigation system was already running, and I had no idea how much damage had been done. Had I poisoned my entire garden? I didn't know, but I had to stop it now. I grabbed a flashlight, went straight to the backyard, and began disconnecting the irrigation system from the third tank. My hands were shaking as I did it, my mind racing with the horror of what I had just discovered. But I wasn't alone in this. I called Tom over, and together we started reviewing the footage from the camera. As we sat there watching the grainy video, I saw it. At exactly 2:17 a.m., a figure in a dark jacket walked into my yard, pouring something into the water tank. The camera didn't capture the person's face clearly, but I could see the unmistakable Pinecrest Gardens logo on the jacket. "Marcus," Tom whispered. "That's Marcus Jenkins. He's the HOA compliance officer. He works for Judith." I felt a wave of cold fury wash over me. They had targeted my garden deliberately. They'd poisoned my water to destroy what I loved, what I had worked so hard to build. "This is criminal," Tom said, his voice tight with anger. "We've got to take this to the police." The next morning, I walked into the police station with all the evidence, camera footage, water samples, and the lab results. My stomach churned with dread, but I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just sit back and let them get away with it. Officer Lopez, a middle-aged cop with a tired face, looked up at me from behind his desk. He didn't seem surprised to see me. The police station was familiar with HOA complaints. It wasn't the first time they'd received reports about Judith Winters and her heavy-handed tactics. I sat down, placing my evidence in front of him. "I need to file a report," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The HOA compliance officer, Marcus Jenkins, poisoned my rainwater tanks. I have video footage of him doing it." Officer Lopez leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. "You're saying the HOA compliance officer poisoned your rainwater tanks?" he asked, his voice flat. I nodded. "Yes, it's all on video. I have the footage and the lab results proving that the water is contaminated with herbicide." Lopez sighed and picked up the footage, glancing at it briefly before setting it back down. "Look, Mr. Mitchell, I get it, but these videos can be interpreted different ways. Maybe Marcus was just trying to treat standing water for mosquitoes. Maybe he was just doing his job." I felt my jaw tighten. "No, he wasn't. He was poisoning my water on purpose. This is criminal." Lopez didn't respond. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice lowering. "I'm going to be straight with you, Mitchell. I can file the report, but don't expect the DA to do anything about it. The HOA is too powerful. They've got connections. This will probably get classified as a civil dispute. You'll need to hire a lawyer if you want to go further." I felt my stomach drop. "You're telling me that no one will do anything about this?" Lopez nodded. "Not unless you get a lawyer. It's not an easy battle. Trust me, people who cross Judith Winters have a way of finding themselves in uncomfortable situations." I left the police station with a hollow feeling in my chest. I had the evidence. I had the facts, but it felt like the system was stacked against me. The HOA was too powerful. They had the law on their side. And now I was up against a wall. I spent the next couple of days in a fog of frustration. The police weren't going to help. I had already been dismissed as just another angry homeowner, trying to push back against the HOA. Even the evidence I had seemed to fall on deaf ears. The feeling of powerlessness was suffocating. I was one person up against a powerful, well-connected system. It felt like I was swimming upstream, and the current kept getting stronger. But then something shifted. One evening, after another sleepless night, I got a text from Tom. It was a simple message, but the words sparked something in me. "Come over. We need to talk." I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my jacket, stepped out the door, and made my way over to his house. When I arrived, I was surprised to find more than just Tom waiting for me. Elaine, the elderly woman from down the street, was there too. So were the Rodriguez twins, whose pool permit had been mysteriously delayed for months, and Maria Garcia, who had lived in Pine Crest Gardens longer than anyone else, was sitting at the kitchen table, her face lined with worry but also something else, determination. Tom looked up as I walked in. "Welcome to the resistance," he said with a grim smile. I raised an eyebrow. "Resistance?" Tom nodded. "Judith might have won this round, but we're not going to let her win the war. You're not the only one who's had issues with her, and we've been keeping track." Maria pushed a thick folder across the table. "We've been documenting everything, the selective enforcement, the unexplained fines, the mysterious changes to the covenants. It's all in here." I flipped through the pages. It was incredible. There were photographs, emails, records showing how Judith and her board had abused their power. The Changs had been denied a fence permit while Judith's friend got an identical permit approved the same day. The Patel family had been subjected to months of water issues after they questioned the HOA's financial dealings. Mrs. Wilson's beautiful garden had been destroyed by accidental weed killer overspray. "This isn't just about your rainwater system, James," Maria said, her voice steady. This has been going on for months. Years even. The HOA is targeting people who don't fit into Judith's perfect little picture of Pinecrest Gardens. I felt my blood pressure rise as I continued flipping through the folder. This is insane, I muttered. How has no one done anything about this? Fear, Tom said simply. People are scared. Judith controls the board, and she's got connections everywhere. But we can't be afraid anymore. You've got video evidence of criminal activity. This is bigger than just one person's fight. I looked around the table at the faces of my neighbors, all of them with stories of their own about how Judith had bullied them or their families. They were all tired of being silent, tired of being afraid, and now they were ready to fight. Do you think we can actually do something about it? I asked. We can, Tom said, but we need to expose her. We need to make sure everyone in the neighborhood knows what she's been doing. Maria leaned forward. We need a lawyer, someone who knows how to fight back, who isn't afraid of her. I nodded. I've got a friend who's a lawyer. He specializes in property rights. I'll reach out to him. Over the next few days, I kept in contact with Tom, Maria, and the others. We started organizing. The more I talked to my neighbors, the more I realized just how much of an impact Judith had had on this community. People who had once been friendly and welcoming now felt like strangers. The fear she instilled in everyone had been powerful. But the more we spoke, the more I saw something change in the air, a sense of unity. People were starting to stand up. I reached out to Dylan, the lawyer I'd mentioned to Tom, and set up a meeting. Dylan had been a college roommate of mine, and now he was working for a law firm that specialized in property law. I needed his expertise, and I needed him to look at the evidence we had gathered. He agreed to meet the next day. When I arrived at his office, he greeted me with a firm handshake. "What's going on, James?" he asked, settling into his chair. I pulled out all the documents, photos, and video footage we had collected. I laid them out on his desk, watching his eyes as he flipped through them. He was quiet, but his brow furrowed with each new piece of evidence. "This is bad," he said finally, after reviewing everything. "The HOA's actions go well beyond just enforcing rules. You've got evidence of criminal activity, property damage, and even environmental contamination. This isn't just a civil dispute anymore, James. This is illegal." I could feel a spark of hope ignite in me. "So, what do we do now?" Dylan leaned back in his chair, thinking. "We build a case. We document everything. We need to get more neighbors involved. You've got video evidence, and I think we can turn that into something that forces the HOA to answer for their actions." "What about the police?" I asked. "They won't do anything." Dylan smiled, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. "The police might be turning a blind eye, but we don't need them right now. We'll take this to court, and with this kind of evidence, we can take them down." I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. For the first time in days, I felt like we actually had a chance to win this. As the days passed, our group of allies grew. More and more neighbors came forward, willing to join the fight. The stories we heard were eerily similar. Everyone had been subjected to the same tactics: intimidation, unfair fines, and a complete disregard for their property rights. One night, we met at Maria's house to plan our next steps. There were 15 of us gathered around the table, each of us contributing something to the cause. Some were gathering more evidence, while others were starting to organize the community. We knew that if we were going to win, we had to show the HOA that we weren't just a few isolated voices. We were the whole neighborhood. "We need to get this to the media," Maria said, her voice firm. "If the community knows what Judith's been doing, there's no way she'll be able to stay in power." "I agree," I said, "but we need to make sure we have everything." The lawyer said we need to document everything: photos, emails, even text messages. We can't afford to leave anything to chance. Tom added, "We also need to make sure we're ready for retaliation. They're going to try to silence us, to intimidate us into backing down. We can't let them." I nodded. "We won't. This is bigger than just my garden now. This is about our homes, our rights. We're going to make sure they can't get away with this anymore." It felt like the walls were closing in on me, but there was a strange sense of resolve settling in my chest. We had the evidence. We had the community behind us. And now it was time to make our move. The HOA was not going to take kindly to our efforts. I knew that, but what other choice did we have? We couldn't let them continue to trample over our rights, over our lives, simply because they wanted control. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about me and my garden anymore. It was about every single one of us who had been targeted, every homeowner who had been unfairly fined or silenced. The night before our planned confrontation with the HOA, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept racing through every possible scenario. What if they called the police? What if they tried to intimidate us with threats of legal action? What if they tried to use their influence to silence us? But then I thought of the faces of my neighbors, the ones who had stood by me, who had shared their stories, their own battles with the HOA. We weren't going to back down. This fight wasn't just mine. It was ours. At 7:30 a.m. the next day, I got a text from Tom. It's time. Meet at the community center at 9 a.m. We have everything ready. I was already up, nerves coursing through my body, but a strange feeling of anticipation settled in. This was the moment we had been building toward. We were going to expose the HOA for what they really were, bullies with too much power, too much control over our lives. And we were going to take that power back. When I arrived at the community center, the energy was palpable. It wasn't just a handful of neighbors anymore. It was practically the entire neighborhood. People had come out of the woodwork to support us, many of them afraid of what would happen if they didn't. There were 63 of us gathered in the hall, ready to fight for our homes. Tom stood at the front, a sense of quiet determination in his posture. Everyone here today is standing for one reason, he said, looking out at the crowd. This isn't just about rainwater barrels or fences or gardens. This is about our right to live here without fear. This is about our right to be treated fairly. Judith and the HOA don't get to dictate our lives anymore. I felt a wave of gratitude for everyone who had shown up. They weren't just here to support me. They were here to take a stand against the injustice they had been living with for years. Together, we had the power to make a real difference. The door to the meeting room opened, and in walked Judith Winters, flanked by Marcus. She was wearing her usual smug expression, as if she owned the place. She walked straight to the front, where she tried to take control of the meeting, but the mood in the room had shifted. People weren't going to let her steamroll them this time. What is this? Judith demanded, slamming her gavel down. This meeting was called to discuss vandalism and criminal behavior in the community. This is not the time for your petty grievances. I stood up and walked to the front, feeling the eyes of the entire room on me. My heart was racing, but I kept my voice steady. Actually, Judith, this meeting is about much more than vandalism. It's about the corruption in this community. It's about the HOA you've been using as a personal tool of power and control. Judith's face flushed with anger. You're out of line, Mitchell. You have no right to come in here and make accusations. I have every right, I said, my voice growing stronger. I've got video footage of your compliance officer poisoning my garden. I've got evidence of selective enforcement, environmental damage, and kickbacks to contractors that benefit you personally. The HOA has been targeting homeowners who don't fit your perfect little mold, and I'm here to put a stop to it. The room was silent as I played the video footage on the projector, showing Marcus pouring chemicals into my rainwater tanks. The video was clear, time-stamped, and irrefutable. Judith's face went pale as the footage filled the screen. She sputtered, trying to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. And that's not all, I continued, my voice rising. I've got more. I've got photos, emails, and documents showing that you've been abusing your power to force people into making decisions that line your pockets. You've manipulated the rules for your personal gain, and it's time the whole community knew about it. The room erupted into chaos. People were shouting, demanding answers, pointing fingers. Judith tried to regain control of the meeting, but the damage was done. The video had exposed her for what she really was, a power-hungry bully, using the HOA to push her own agenda. Then, from the back of the room, a quiet voice spoke up. It's not just James. It's all of us. The voice belonged to Sophia Jenkins, Marcus's daughter. She stepped forward, her hands shaking but her voice steady. "This is my dad's dash cam footage," she said, holding up a USB drive. "It's all backed up in the cloud. My dad didn't know I had access to it, but I do." Sophia plugged the drive into the projector, and the footage played once again. This time, it showed Judith and Marcus discussing their plans to force me out of my home, and how they would use the poisoned water to justify removing my rainwater collection system. The conversation was clear and damning. Marcus, who had been sitting quietly at the front of the room, suddenly stood up. His face was pale, his eyes wide with shock. "Sophia, you shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice cracking. "This isn't what you think." "It's exactly what I think," Sophia replied, her voice full of courage. "I can't stand by and watch you ruin this community. You're part of the problem." The room fell silent as everyone processed what they had just seen. Judith was done. The proof was undeniable, and now the entire community knew the truth. Judith tried one last-ditch effort to salvage her power. "This is defamation," she yelled, trying to assert control. "These are baseless accusations meant to ruin my reputation." But the crowd wasn't having it. "You've been destroying this community for years," someone shouted. "It's time for you to go." The anger in the room was palpable. One by one, people began raising their hands to call for a vote of no confidence in the HOA board. They had had enough. Judith's time was up. Maria Garcia stepped forward, holding up a thick folder. "According to the original bylaws, if 2/3 of homeowners are present, we can force a special review of the board's conduct." We had more than 2/3. The vote was overwhelming. I stood there, my heart pounding as the vote was counted. The room erupted in cheers as Judith's position as president of the HOA was officially revoked. The victory was sweet, but the war wasn't quite over. Judith and Marcus were escorted out of the meeting, and we made plans to ensure they would never be able to bully this community again. It was time for real change. The next day, I received a text from Dylan. "The lien on your house has been suspended. They're backing down." Couldn't believe it. It was finally over. The HOA had been exposed for the corrupt organization it was, and I had the community to thank for standing with me. As I walked through my garden that evening, the weight of the past few weeks began to lift. The heirloom tomatoes were still there, growing strong once again. My garden, my peace, and my community had survived. The days after the HOA's downfall were filled with a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion. The weight of everything that had happened seemed to lift off my shoulders, but the neighborhood was still buzzing with the energy of the victory. People were talking to each other again, engaging with neighbors they'd never spoken to before. The tension that had hung over Pinecrest Gardens for so long was finally gone. I spent the next few weeks in my garden, tending to my plants, making sure the damage from the poisoning was reversed. The rainwater tanks were no longer just a method of collecting water, they had become a symbol of resilience. The heirloom tomatoes, once fragile and dying, were now thriving. My peppers were starting to bloom again, and even the flowers I had planted were reaching towards the sun. As I worked, I couldn't help but reflect on how far we'd come. It felt like a lifetime ago when I first received that letter from the HOA, demanding I remove my rainwater system. I'd been terrified at the time, afraid of losing my home, my garden, my peace. But now, looking at the neighborhood, I saw something different. We had reclaimed our community, and together we were stronger than ever. The new HOA board, made up of residents who actually cared about the well-being of the neighborhood, was a breath of fresh air. They worked with the community, not against it. They listened to people's concerns and made decisions that benefited everyone, not just a few wealthy individuals. For the first time in a long time, people were smiling when they talked to each other. At the next neighborhood gathering, the new HOA board addressed the residents, promising more transparency and a focus on community involvement. The whole room was full of people who were ready to move forward, and it felt like we were all finally united under a common goal: to protect our homes and our rights. It wasn't just the neighborhood that had changed. I had changed too. The person who walked into that meeting room, terrified of the power the HOA wielded, was no longer the same person who stood in front of that crowd, armed with evidence and the support of his neighbors. I had found my voice, and in doing so, I had found strength I didn't know I had. The victory in the community was a reflection of my own growth. I learned that sometimes standing up to bullies isn't about being the biggest or the loudest. It's about being willing to fight for what's right, even when it feels like you're the only one who sees the problem. And when you do that, you often find that there are others who have been waiting for someone to take the first step. As I looked out at my garden, I felt a deep sense of pride. This was more than just a patch of land. It was a symbol of my family's legacy. It was a reminder that when you stand up for yourself, you stand up for what matters. My grandmother's heirloom tomatoes had survived. My garden had survived. And the community had survived. The aftermath for Judith and Marcus was inevitable. The press coverage surrounding the exposure of their corruption was impossible to ignore. People all over the city had heard about what had happened in Pinecrest Gardens, and soon, investigations were launched into their financial dealings. Judith, who had once seemed untouchable, was now facing scrutiny she couldn't avoid. The once powerful president of the HOA had been ousted not just by the board, but by the entire community. The police, who had once dismissed our complaints, began to take a closer look at the corruption within the HOA. Marcus, too, was facing consequences for his involvement. The pressure from both the community and law enforcement was too much for them to handle. The community had turned the tide. The power had shifted, and the message was clear. No one, no matter how powerful they were, was above the law. Not even Judith Winters. As I sat on my porch one evening, watching the sun set over my garden, I thought about everything that had happened. Felt surreal, almost like a dream. A few months ago, I had been just another homeowner worried about fines and garden rules. But now I had led my community to victory. We had exposed corruption, taken back control, and restored peace to our neighborhood. I realized something important that night. This battle had never been just about my garden. It had been about something much bigger, about standing up for what was right, about fighting against the forces that try to control and silence us. And in the end, it wasn't just about winning a fight. It was about reclaiming our power. The neighborhood was thriving. My garden was thriving. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had truly made a difference. In the days that followed, I continued to work on my garden, but now it wasn't just about growing food, it was about growing something more. It was about nurturing a sense of community, a belief that we could all come together and fight for what was right. I had spent so much time worrying about losing my garden, but what I realized through this whole experience was that my garden wasn't just a place to grow vegetables. It was a place of growth for me, too. I had grown as a person, as a leader, and as a member of a community. I looked around at the neighborhood. People were talking, laughing, and engaging with each other again. There was no more fear hanging over us. No more whispers behind closed doors. It felt like a weight had been lifted, and for the first time in years, Pinecrest Gardens felt like a true community again. I smiled to myself, knowing that, in the end, it wasn't just about the garden or the HOA. It was about the people, the ones who stood up for each other, who fought for what was right, and who, together, made a difference. So, what would you say to someone else who's dealing with an HOA that's overstepping their bounds? Tom asked me one night, sitting on the porch with me. I looked at him, a smile tugging at my lips. Tell them this, I said. No matter how small you feel, no matter how powerful they seem, you have the power to change things. Stand up, fight back, and when you do, you'll find that you're not alone. You're never alone. Together, we can take back control. And as I looked out over my garden, I knew that we had done just that. We had taken control, and we had won.